Welcome to the Real Clear Investigations Podcast. I'm RCI's editor, J. Peder Zane, joined as always by RCI senior reporter, Jim Varney. Hey, Jim, how you doing?
Ciao, Peder.
We're very excited this week to welcome Leighton Woodhouse onto the broadcast, who's going to talk to us about his recent RCI article about the bipartisan coalition that's come together to score a bit of a victory in the opposition to animal testing, in this case specifically on the cutest little beagles you've ever seen. But before that, let's head to the news roundup. Our first story this week comes from the New York Times, and it seems like it's an important piece that's raising questions about how well the war in Iran is actually going. Under the headline, U.S. intelligence shows Iran retains substantial missile capabilities, the Times and Facts reports that the 13,000 sorties that we've done against Iran have had little damage to their missiles, their missile launchers, and other programs, which is pretty darn surprising, Jim, don't you think?
I do. And look, the Times story seems very well reported, right? It's talking about looking at intelligence estimates. We know that Senator Kelly came out this week after a classified briefing and was saying much the same thing. We've heard for a long time that we have just shot just about every missile we've got in the silos and on the ships and in the planes. But it's striking to see the Times having sort of specific stats, right? Like I think they said 30 of 33 missile operation launch points, they're back, they have operational. And it does make you wonder just how honest the Trump administration and the Pentagon have been about what's going on in the war. It seems like whenever we do something big, the military doesn't do so well, right? I mean, it's great getting bin Laden, getting Maduro, these very precise kind of ops. But on the big stuff, we seem to struggle still, as we did in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Right.
But,
and yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, it also ignored Israel. Like, you would have never known that Israel was also fighting from this. So I find it a little difficult to believe that the U.S. and Israel, with all their military might, have been as unsuccessful as the Times story portrayed.
And just to sort of put a ribbon on that, and again, everything here may be accurate. It's kind of odd that we pounded Iran for weeks and have depleted, because that was the other part of the story, as you mentioned, depleted so many of our arms that we used against them, but somehow they're unscathed. But what's also interesting is, so this basically the same people who plan these attacks to hopefully completely decimate and decapitate the Iranian regime are the same ones then who can go in and have these incredibly precise figures on how many missile launchers they have left, their capabilities of striking at us in various ways. So you have to accept both the incompetence of the warfare and the extreme competence of the people who go in afterwards and just look at satellite images and can decide how much damage we've done, as you said, very specifically. And that's where you just sort of have to trust the reporting and trust the sources. And I think one of the things we talked about leading up to this broadcast is, nowadays it's very hard not only to trust the media outlets, but to trust the sources that they get their information from, because everything's been so darn politicized that you don't really know who to trust. And I know that that's been the case. People will say, people always used to say, I never believe anything I read.
Right.
I mostly believed what I read until the last few years. And maybe it just took me a long time to come to that. But I now read, all news accounts with a really jaundiced eye of like, what are they trying to accomplish here rather than what are they trying to report?
Well, we do know that they're against the war and that they're vehemently against the Trump administration. So you're right. Those things kind of factor in the back of your mind as you're reading this. And I do think it's kind of amazing that if Iran still has so much capabilities, they sure don't seem to be launching much offense.
Right.
They've been very quiet if they really have got, as the story says, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 or 90% of the capabilities. So
On the other hand, it may explain why Trump's going with the blockade as opposed to more aggressive action.
Right.
So it makes a lot of sense that, if we've depleted our arms, that would be the time to do a blockade, to use your other assets. And Iran, as long as we're not striking them, as many missiles as they may not have enough to seize the day, so they could just be holding their powder. But to that point about, what do you believe and what don't you? Probably the story that got the most attention, at least on Twitter this week, was another New York Times piece, and that was by their columnist, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Nicholas Kristof, who made very serious accusations about Israeli army members and security forces raping Palestinians. Okay, but you and I both had some questions about this story because at bottom, what he said was, I went to Gaza. He interviewed 14 people. And he says, my reporting for this article based on the conversation with 14 men and women who said they'd been sexually assaulted by Israeli settlers or members of security forces. In many cases, it was possible to corroborate the victims' stories in part by talking to witnesses or, more commonly, to those whom the victims had confided in, such as family members, lawyers, and social workers. In other cases, it was not possible. So this guy goes there and he basically takes people's word about horrific charges in a war zone to then basically argue that the United States is complicit in rape and we should stop funding or probably having anything to do with Israel. I mean,
and I think another thing that made it people maybe a little skeptical about the whole thing was the timing of it, because this civil commission in Israel, which had spent 2 years or more pouring over thousands and thousands of video clips and testimony and interviews that they had done, they released their report this week documenting how Hamas used systemic sexual violence and rape in their October 7th attacks. So the Israeli Foreign Ministry tweeted out that they had approached the New York Times, telling them, look, we've got this huge commission report, deeply sourced and everything, blue ribbon panel. We'd like to work with you on this. The Times said, no, we're not interested. And on the night before this report is going to go public, Kristof drops his piece. And then Kristof alleges that dogs were raping them and that they were trained to rape these prisoners. That seems a little bizarre to me. I don't doubt that in many cases, the Israelis probably haven't treated their Palestinian captives well, but dogs raping them. And then Kristof even says, to your point that you just read, that he thinks it's far-fetched that these people would lie to malign Israel. I don't think that's far-fetched at all.
Yeah, I think the dog thing really is a tell. And what I mean is when somebody's really doing something that's slightly unhinged, maybe, here's my Dr. Freud here, they unconsciously include an element that will reveal how unhinged they are, because his story didn't need that. And to believe somebody who said, I was raped, not just raped by a dog, but raped by a dog that was trained to rape me, really, and to report that, without corroboration. And I think that's the larger point, that these people may have been telling the truth, okay? But unless you have photographs of their injuries, they went to a doctor who treated them. And it may be that they were not able to do that because of their circumstances. I get that. But if you can't verify to any meaningful extent what people are telling you, again, in a war zone, at a time when people lie all the time for advantage, you wonder why they reported it, or what their good faith reason was for reporting it.
I think that's a totally fair question. And obviously they're trying to make it sound like Abu Ghraib, which he also mentions in the story. But I felt like he was throwing also a lot of different things in the basket, like the whole thing with the settlers. I'm not sure that has anything to do with the October 7th and Hamas terrorists. That's something that I guess has been going on maybe for a long time. And Kristof had great detail too, right? Like at one point he says that the guy's thrown on the floor and he has bits of other people's teeth embedded in his skin, which I wasn't quite clear to me how that would have happened, but nice detail. But I just feel like the timing of it is deeply suspect. Many of the sources, even the 14 that he talked to, have been shown since to be deeply suspect. So the whole story has a little bit of an odor to it, let's say.
And what'll be interesting to see is whether or not the mainstream media, the rest of the legacy media that, follows behind the Times, picks up on this, whether it gets legs. I was talking to one of our reporters the other day, how the legacy media often says, well, this was reported by an outlet, but if it's not part of their little group, they go, but we couldn't independently confirm it, so we didn't report it. When in fact, they repeat each other's stories all the time without verifying it. That's one of the biggest dodges, phony things. I want to end on, it's not just what you report and how you report it, but also what you don't report. And so, again, going to the New York Times, and we're not picking on them, but they in fact are one of the largest newsrooms. I was shocked. They have like 2,300 journalists, and by comparison, amazing. The Washington Post has about 500 to 600. So the resources and the influence they have, the way that other legacy outlets look to them for guidance of how they should be doing their job. So I just very quickly want to point out that the Times has written 8 to a dozen stories so far on Trump's effort to renovate the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. And there'd been a plan to spend $300 million to do it. He instead put out a no-bid contract. It was supposedly going to be a $1.5 million contract. Now, according to the Times, it's up to $13 million. So on the one hand, definitely a story, something we should look into. Is he rewarding his friends, and what's up with a no-bid contract? But it's interesting to note the number of stories that they've written on this reflecting pool compared to the number of stories they've written on a far bigger scandal, which is the fraud in Medicaid and Medicare, billions of dollars that has been shown to be by RCI and others going to phantom outfits and whatever. And I just am discouraged that, if we had the New York Times on that case, maybe we could make headway in really making reform. And instead, they seem more interested in pursuing anything and everything that can get Trump.
And as Senator Fetterman tweeted out about it, it's like $13 million, guys? Really? That's what we're going to make a big case about? I mean, it's peanuts. And then you got a he said, they said kind of thing with Trump claiming that he didn't have anything to do with the no-bid contract. The Times says that the firm that got hired was one that had worked on swimming pools at one of his resorts. Who knows there? But at the end of the day, 13 million, and no discussion at all about why were we talking about 300 million. And in fact, one of the groups that is the source for the Times' story on this was set to get millions of dollars in grants. So they have an axe to grind in all of this. And
it's
but the scale of that to the tens of billions that's happening all around the country. And in fact, now we know that in Ohio, Republican governor there helped ease restrictions on how this Medicaid, Medicare stuff would get paid. So the Times has a GOP target there that they could go after, but they're just choosing not to.
Right. That was the Daily Wire has been doing a terrific series on the Medicaid in Ohio, and we'll include a link to that at the bottom of this. Okay, well, that's it for the roundup this week. And now I am happy to move on to our main interview, Leighton Woodhouse, who wrote an article for Real Clear Investigations this week about the animal testing opposition. Welcome, Leighton.
Thank you.
Hi, Leighton.
Hi.
So,
glad to be here.
One of the things I love is we got to use a dateline here, which you don't see on stories so much anymore when everybody works from their basement. But you actually went to Blue Mounds, Wisconsin, to report an article for Real Clear Investigations on animal testing center, Ridgeland Farms, in that town in Wisconsin. Who is Ridgeland Farms, and why are they in the news?
So Ridgeland Farms is a breeder of beagles specifically that they sell to scientific laboratories to be used in often painful, usually lethal scientific experiments. They're the second. There's actually only two such breeders in the United States. They're the second biggest. The biggest is Marshall Bio Research in upstate New York. But Ridgeland had, depending on how you look at it, they're still being released, but about 2,000 beagles in captivity at the time of the protest that they were planning to sell to scientists.
So they breed beagles and they sell them to laboratories. Tell us why beagles as opposed to Havanese or Chihuahuas?
Beagles are small and they're docile and they're bred to be eager to please to human beings. So they become very easy for lab technicians to handle. So the fact that they're so nice and friendly and forgiving makes them easy to become, pincushions for laboratory tests.
Wow. No good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah.
So your story reports that there was a win for and in fact, when we sent you out there, we didn't know what was going to happen, but in fact, it turned into a win for the animal rights movement regarding Ridgeland Farms, and it was brought about in part by a surprising bipartisan coalition of people opposed to this testing. So what was the win and who got together to help bring it about?
Yeah, so it was the short-term outcome was a huge defeat, which then shortly after turned into a victory. So there's a long history here. There have been activists who have been fighting to shut down Ridgeland Farms for the better part of a decade. In 2017, I reported on this investigation that was done where some of these activists broke into Ridgeland Farms to document the conditions inside. I co-wrote a piece with Glenn Greenwald for The Intercept about that. That was 8 years ago. And then since then, there have been several other attempts to breach this facility. Well, there have been two more attempts to breach this facility. One of them was just in March of this year when activists converged on Ridgeland Farms, about 100 activists, broke into the facility with crowbars and removed 30 beagles, 8 of whom were intercepted by police and sent back to the breeder, but 22 of whom were put into adoptive homes. So that was in March, and the attention that action galvanized was huge. It was a viral story, and thousands of people were asking how they could help. So the activists organized another rescue for the following month, the month of April, in which they plan to gather 2,000 people. And in the end, I think they ended up getting about a little over 1,000 to surround the facility, break into it with power tools, strip the fences, cut into the fences, break off the doors, and remove all 2,000 beagles. And that was the part that was not successful. What happened is that there was sort of these, it was a combination of a mass action where there were going to be 1,000 people showing up. And the theory was that law enforcement will not be able to handle that many people. So no matter how prepared they were, if they arrest one person, there's 5 other people getting through. So there's sort of that mass action with also a more covert action, which would be done initially where strike teams would go in and cut open the fences and then break into the buildings, creating those openings for 1,000 activists to stream through.
Wow.
And it was very audacious, very bold, and it was public, right? They said, this is what we're doing. They announced it weeks in advance. That was the only way you can get 1,000 people to sign up and travel out to Wisconsin to participate. And they were successful in building that mass action. What was not anticipated was that the police response would be as aggressive as it was. I was there. The police responded immediately with tear gas canisters and mace And it's just for the next 6 hours or so, it was just a bombardment of chemical weapons. And it was physically impossible. It was very clear immediately that it was no dogs were going to get saved that day. It was physically impossible for the activists to be able to get through. An activist would cut open a piece of the fence and they'd be maced immediately and dragged and thrown to the ground and handcuffed by the cops who were actually inside the perimeter of the fence. So that was the defeat.
So hold on one second before we leave that then, since we got into the protest already. Tell me how you found out about this, who some of the people who were leading the protest were. And then I want to get maybe a little later how you as a journalist, because so much the line is blurring between journalists and activists, how you comport yourself, what rules you follow so that you're a neutral observer amidst this mayhem, and when you're obviously came with one side.
Right. So the group that put it together was sort of an ad hoc coalition called, I believe it was called like the Coalition to Save Ridgeland Dogs or something like that. The campaign had been led prior to April by a group called Direct Action Everywhere, and for not very interesting reasons, they didn't go under that name, reasons having to do with the person who was leading it was no longer affiliated with the organization, blah, blah, blah. So it became this coalition. I should mention that, so there were two coalitions, which were working, aware of each other's existence, but not really working directly in coordination with each other. There were the open rescue people, who were the activists doing the breach and removing the beagles. And then there was this coalition of advocacy groups and rescuers who had been negotiating for months with Ridgeland to try to purchase the dogs and rescue them and adopt them out that way. Those two coalitions were working sometimes at cross purposes with one another, never in direct coordination, but with a shared goal. And so those were the two coalitions that were leading it.
And were these with the coalition? Just one quick thing before we leave that: are these mostly full-time people who are committed to they draw their salary opposing animal testing and advocating for animal rights, or are these people who have other jobs who this is their vocation? Yeah,
I would say very few are full-time. Among the people who are sort of the planners and the organizers of it, I would characterize them as a combination of people who work. A small number of them work full-time in the animal rights movement. So not for this. It's not as if this coalition had staff and a budget and resources. They work for other groups, other advocacy groups. I'd say most of the people who are even the most in the center of it, organizing and planning it, are people who are very committed to this cause and very committed to doing activism in the time that they have available to them, but otherwise work, regular jobs. That includes many people who I was out with. Like, for example, I mentioned in the story, one guy was a fabricator. He worked at a factory building fuel tanks. Then among the mass group of people who showed up, that the profile of that group, the overwhelming majority of the 1,000 or so people, were what we would describe as just normies. People who they weren't even people who were political, which was pretty amazing, because often you go to these things and it's like people who are, if they're not paid, then they're like sort of lifestyle activists. This was not that. So there were many people who just came out from, a guy who's a retired pilot who came out from South Carolina, somebody else who worked in a welding plant, I believe, nearby in Wisconsin, who told me that his politics leaned right. Most of these people weren't particularly political, and they certainly weren't activists, and they never participated in anything like this before. But we're talking about dogs here. We're talking about dogs being tortured. So there's an incentive there for people who are not sort of ideologically committed to the cause to show up, and that was the vast majority of people there, and that was the vast majority of the people who ended up sucking up tear gas all day.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I'm comfortable with the tactics here, but your story really touched me. All dogs are my brothers. I grew up with dogs. We've had 2 dogs in the house for 25 years, not the same dogs. We had 2 Havanese right now. So, I mean, I really love dogs. And then I didn't even know this was happening. Yeah. And where I live in Louisiana, Tulane has a primate research center. And occasionally activists will come and free some of the primates, and there'll be stories that they got these apes down under the underpass or down by the Trinidad River or something. But there's obviously science is involved in all this. And you can sort of understand, I think, a little bit with the primates since they seem so similar to man. I didn't know exactly what is the scientific basis for using beagles. Have there been any breakthroughs from beagle research? That you mentioned some animal research breakthroughs in your story, but was that from beagles? Like, why are we doing dogs?
So the species is fairly arbitrary. As I said, it's basically because they're easy for the technicians to handle. The choice of dogs is fairly arbitrary. In a lot of these cases, so there are there's two different tests that are done, or two different sort of categories of tests that are done. There are tests that are done on drugs to pass FDA clearance, and the FDA is moving away from animal testing. I believe in a serious way. And so those are like, you have to do a primate and a non-primate test, or you have to do a test on a rodent and then a non-rodent. And so dogs just have been thrown into the mix as one of the typical animals that get
for pharmaceutical companies.
For pharmaceutical companies, and that's just based on FDA regulations, which are now actually no longer the FDA Modernization Act 2.0 eliminated that mandate, and now they are moving. I think there's a new legislation to try to move them even further away from that FDA testing. The lion's share of this experimentation is done by NIH-funded scientists, and this is not drug approval or safety testing. This is basic science research. So the idea being that with much of science that is applied and has an immediate medical or commercial application, you don't need the government to fund that stuff because you've got plenty of investors, corporations that are willing to do it, who stand to make a lot of money off of that research. But if you're just a white coat at a university and you're curious about the effect of something on another thing, and there's no immediate medical or commercial application to it, that's where NIH comes in and funds your research. So it's very hard to say, especially now. It was easier in the past to say this particular experiment led to this particular breakthrough, because what the scientists are doing is they're creating data. They are generating data. And that data gets published, and then that data presumably is used by other scientists in their research, and presumably somewhere down the line, there are breakthroughs that come through. It's a complicated question.
They're saying, Leighton, that it's science. Like, this isn't cosmetics or something that we're talking about.
Correct. It's science insofar as it is curiosity driven. It's the object is to produce data which is published in scientific journals. It's conducted by scientists, PhDs on university campuses. So to that extent, yes, it is science. There's I think a more philosophical question, which you may or may not be interested in getting into, as to whether some of these tests, which are quite arbitrary, are really categorized as science. But I believe that the question you're asking, the answer is yes, it is science. It's not testing for cosmetics or anything like that.
It's heartbreaking to me. I don't know why they can't use rats.
Well, they do use rats. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the tens of millions of animals that are used in these experiments are mice, rats, fish, guinea pigs, and those animals cannot be counted because they're not reported. There's no legal requirement to report them, and they're exempt from American Welfare Act, from Animal Welfare Act laws. So tens of millions of mice and other animals are used.
And activists aren't breaking into places to free rats. We got plenty of them as it is. So there isn't anything specific that we can thank the Beagle for. It'd be another reason, it seems to me, to stop doing it.
Yeah. You could thank the Beagle for creating reams of data that have been published in some scientific journals somewhere. You can thank the Beagles for that. Yeah.
Right. And, to your point about the, tens of millions of these other smaller animals, so that puts in context both the 2,000 beagles that were at Ridgeland, and which Jim's probably not going to like this at all. You also said that there are about 62,000 dogs and cats
Yeah.
experimented on each year. So
Yeah.
using that 62,000 number, there was still, though, a little victory with Ridgeland Farms and their 2,000 or 1,500 of their 2,000 animals. And it came about in part through not just the activists who went to protest, but their support from some MAGA influencers, right? Including Laura Trump and Laura
Right.
Loomer.
Yes. So, so those two coalitions I discussed earlier, they're the ones doing the direct action, breaching and rescue, open rescues of the beagles, and then the other coalition, the rescuers that were trying to make a deal with Ridgeland. What happened is that, so they were kind of working in parallel. Like the activists, for example, were aware that these negotiations were taking place, and they were actually ready to call off the confrontation if a deal had fell into place in time. That didn't happen, so the action went forward. But meanwhile, these groups were still talking to Ridgeland. Depending on who you ask, the open rescue action was either helpful or a hindrance to those negotiations. That's for further reporting to unpack, and a lot of these discussions are very secretive, so it's hard to figure it out. But within days of the failed open rescue, a deal was announced and this is after months of negotiating and years of campaigning, and it happened a few days after this attempted open rescue. A deal was announced that 1,500 of the 2,000 beagles would be sold to these groups and placed in adoptive homes. And the other 500 who remain are very likely to also be released. They're in those talks now.
Huh.
And to get to your second point about the coalition, the kind of the point of the article, there has been a very unlikely political coalition that has come together around this. And I don't want to use the word coalition too strongly, because it's not as if everybody I'm talking about is working with everybody else. They're not in the same, chat rooms, but they are. But there's the traditional animal rights movement that have been doing their piece of it. And then there has been a huge surge in support from the MAGA right, from, I should say, some of whom are still MAGA and some of whom are not. This includes, I say that because it includes very prominently Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rand Paul, who are now in the crosshairs of Trump, but who would have been considered in his coalition before. But people who are certainly on the right and who have been to a large extent organized by a group called White Coat Waste Project, which has very consciously, deliberately gone out and tried to organize people on the right against inhumane animal testing, and on the basis that it's not just inhumane, but also a massive waste of taxpayer dollars, which is something that is appealing to people on the right.
Right.
And they've been very successful. And then there's also the notoriety of Anthony Fauci, who has been he's sort of the poster boy for animal testing. That has also negatively polarized a lot of people against animal testing. But this has been coalescing for a few years. And one of the groups that was engaged in the negotiations around the purchase of these dogs was a group that called Big Dog Rescue, and Laura Trump is on the board of that organization. And as you mentioned, Laura Loomer tweets incessantly about this about this cause. It says that she's spoken to Trump about it directly. So there's been this surprising outpouring of support for this stuff on the right, which I think is a harbinger for the future.
Well, I don't think it's that surprising. Anybody that sees your story, and they should go to Real Clear Investigations and see it. Just the first few graphs and the photos, I think everybody's going to be on the side. I didn't know this was happening.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed. What's going on with the New York place?
Well, right now, it's too early to say.
Right.
They are, I would say this, they've been publicly pointed to as the next facility sort of under I don't want to say the next facility in the focus of activists. So Wayne Pacelli, who's the head of, who used to be the director of the Humane Society and now heads up one of the organizations that was negotiating the purchase, called the Center for Humane Economy. He's mentioned Marshall Farms, which is the facility in upstate New York. So is Lori Simmons, I believe, who's the head of Big Dog Rescue, the one that Lara Trump is on the board of. And so have the activists who have been who were organizing the direct action. So I believe I think I can say with confidence that that will be the next high profile sort of goal for this movement, is to get the dogs out of there.
Hey, I want
and by the way, I should mention that there's 20,000 dogs at
wow.
I think it's 20,000 animals. Don't quote me on this, but it's about 8 to 10 times the size of Ridgeland in terms of the number of beagles.
Well, you're in the podcast, so you're quoted, but
okay, yeah, true.
I want to go back though to this idea because, obviously on a human level, the idea of experimenting on dogs feels a lot different than experimenting on a guinea pig. Although they're all God's creatures, but they do, right? And so you, though, as a journalist, when you're covering this, just talk to me a little bit. Obviously, you need to earn the trust, mostly of the activists who are letting you know about their plans and whatever. But you also can't just be their cheerleader. So how do you retain your neutrality? And does it ever become an issue with people who think, well, you must be on our side and be, a publicist for us in some way? How do you navigate, explaining to people and operating, at a distance from either side?
So first of all, I've been reporting on this for a number of years, as I mentioned before. So it's like I've got a paper trail in terms of people can look to what my reporting has said, how fair they deem it to be, how unfair they deem it to be. So it's not as if there's any secret there. These activists in particular, I've known many of them for many years. As I said, I was reporting on Ridgeland first in 2017, and so it was many of the same people involved back then as who are involved now. And I just asked if I could come along to report on it. And this particular movement is very open. Like literally, the name of their strategy is Open Rescue, and the tactic is, the strategy is that they go in and they conduct these rescues with no masks on. They break into facilities. They carry out felony criminal actions or things that are chargeable as felonies without masks on, and videotaping themselves, and then they put it out in the media. So it's not, so the whole point is to be very open. So nobody ever asked me to not report on this or not report on that. They were very open book about it. So it wasn't too hard to negotiate that relationship in this particular action, because I wasn't being asked to do anything that I wouldn't otherwise be doing. I wore a huge press hat and labeling, partially to try to protect myself from the violence of the police, but that's usually only marginally successful doing that. But yeah, I did. I wasn't I would say that I wasn't put in a position to.
Can I ask you a question? So we have Nancy Rommelman, who and others. We have them go out, and they've also reported on activists and protests, and it is now extremely hard to get these people to talk to you unless you've been certified as being on their side at 15 different levels. So I know you've reported a lot on other protests too.
Yeah.
Do you find this openness is increasingly rare in the world of activism?
Yes. So you're right. I have reported on other protests in which I've been physically threatened myself. So I reported on the riots against the immigration enforcement in L.A., downtown L.A. I wrote a piece about it for the Free Press, and the guy, directly confronted me and told me he was going to fuck me up, quote unquote. So Antifa, I've been threatened by those guys. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. this particular movement, which I'm very well acquainted with, more acquainted with than some of these protests where I've just been kind of almost like a quote unquote war correspondent, just parachuted in and just like documented what was happening. I have relationships with some of these folks, but it's also a totally different kind of movement. So this is I should make this distinction, because when you hear about using angle grinders and power saws to break it and Halligan bars to break down doors, that sounds very aggressive, and it is very aggressive. But this is a movement that is very, very disciplined and very philosophically fixated on nonviolence in the sort of Gandhi MLK tradition. It's a big part of the training. And so this is just part of the ethos, is that they're not, and it also, it's a better organized movement. Unlike, I've report Antifa, when they do the black bloc things, like a lot of them don't know each other. They don't know each other are because they're all wearing masks. They show up to an event and they just know that if you're wearing masks and you're black blocked up, then you are on their side. Good. So it sort of becomes a recipe for mob control. And by the way, it also becomes a recipe for like anybody can dress up like that and instigate anything. Yes,
like
mob incitement.
Those guys.
It's very prone to violent agitation. And in LA, it was different. People weren't wearing masks. It wasn't Antifa, but it was spontaneous, and that's what I wrote about in the piece. It was not an organized thing by a bunch of people who'd been organizing for months in little cells. It was legitimately spontaneous, which means that you're going to get people who are not disciplined at all and people who are looking for a fight. This was a different kind of movement than that. So there were incidents where people lobbed a tear gas canister back over the fence at the cops, and then other people would roll in. No, we don't do that. This is nonviolent. There were cases where somebody would be like accosting a cop. Oh, you think you're a man for protecting this company from abusing these beagles, and people would go and say, "Quiet, that's nonviolent. Or, we're nonviolent, and we consider that to be violent engagement."
But in terms of navigating it, like Peder was saying, what about the other side? Like, did NIH and the company, did they treat you like you're an activist? Were they open about their side and talkative?
So NIH is interesting. I know Jay Bhattacharya, the head of NIH. I've interviewed him. I've been to his house, actually. And he is, I wouldn't have a lot of luck talking to him now, because this is a subject that he's not interested in talking to anybody about, because it's a very prickly one. You can imagine the politics of it, because he's got, all these people within the Trump administration who are advocating for ending this animal testing. And he is so far dragged his feet on doing so. But I contacted one of the lobby groups for the industry. She was happy to talk to me. I quoted her at length in it. The police wouldn't talk to me, but I think that's just because when you call the Dane County Sheriff's Office, they have a voicemail that says, if you're calling about Ridgeland, press 7. So it's like they were being absolutely inundated with calls. So I don't take that to mean more than it does. And so, yeah, I haven't had a problem getting statements from folks on the other side of this issue from the activists. And I should say that I would be more than happy to do much more than that. I would be more than happy to go and do, watch some of these experiments myself if there's nothing to hide. So that's I'm an open book.
Jim and I have talked at length about that too, and it's one of the really depressing things about journalism now is that your sources have become so tribal that people decide before they've met you what you're going to say and whether you're going to cheerlead for them or not. And then they decide then whether or not they're going to talk to you. And I understand in a very specific instance, maybe this won't be my interest to talk to this guy, but I don't think they understand that, we really are making an effort to understand what's going on, right? Like you couldn't have written this story without knowing why is the animal testing going on. Right. And that, of course, was a big part of your article because there's a rationale for this. And I want to just ask you one other thing, because we talked about the protesters. Have you noticed that the cops are becoming, because you mentioned with the tear gas and whatever, are they at protests in general becoming a little more aggressive?
I wouldn't be able to make that generalization. I can say that in some of the protests I've been to, that has absolutely been the case in LA, which was undoubtedly a very violent protest, but the police were extremely violent as well. And I should say just a quick anecdote that I had my professional camera with me. It was obvious that I was press. I was taking pictures. And there was one moment I was ducked behind a bridge and there was a cop who was on the freeway below me. And every time I popped up, he would train his sights on me. And I tested it because I tested kind of timing just to see okay, if I hang out for 30 seconds to pop up, is he still going to do it? And it was clear that he was targeting me as a journalist. So that stuff happens. But also, and in this case with the at Ridgeland, the cops were extremely aggressive in terms of that was the decision that they had made. It wasn't like spontaneous cops just losing their temper. It was like they were going to bombard us with chemical weapons. That's what they were going to do. And they successfully did so. But from what I've heard, this isn't my own reporting, this is indirect, but I have heard from activists that at the first Ridgeland rescue, the month before, there were cops who were apologizing to the activists, who were saying, look, I'm not a bad person. I'm sorry. I'm just doing my job. I'm really sorry I have to do this. One person was described to me as started to well up with tears because they knew what they were doing, which is that they were sending these dogs back to a horrible fate. Right. And they're, just like most Americans, they're dog people too. And they felt awful for what they were doing. So totally different profiles from one open rescue attempt to the other, but I think it's a mixed bag.
Right.
That's my unsatisfying answer.
Well, on that note of love, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Really, it's a tremendous article, and I obviously recommend that everybody go to RealClearInvestigations.com and read Puppy Love, which is our headline. And I also want to thank Jim being here as always. And that's it for this week. Please go to RealClearInvestigations.com. Please follow us on Twitter at RC Investigates. You can listen to this podcast on Spotify and Apple and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And until next week, take care.